Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lauren Murray, Executive Director here at Dunham Tavern Museum and Gardens, so welcome. Thank you for coming here. I want to first acknowledge where we are, the traditional homeland of the Lenape, Shawnee, Wyandot, Miami, Ottawa, Potawatomi, and other Great Lakes tribes. Their stewardship made our lives possible, and we recognize the thousands of their descendants who live here now. I also want to acknowledge where we are in a more recent bit of history. One's a stagecoach stop on the Buffalo, Cleveland, Detroit Post Road. The 1824 home of Rufus and Jane Dunham is the oldest building still standing on its original site in the city of Cleveland. The still standing part does mean a lot right now. You might have seen it when you came in. Some weeks ago, we were in the path of a tornado, so we got very lucky. That tree crashed along the front of the building, not right through it. So we do have some rebuilding and restoration to do, but we're going to do that. In stark contrast to the cityscape that surrounds it, Dunham Tavern Museum and Gardens offers a glimpse of history and insight into the lifestyles of early Ohio settlers and travelers. You can imagine my thrill when just a few chapters into Horse, we meet the artist Thomas Scott traveling by stagecoach, like so many did on Euclid Avenue when the Dunhams were here operating their tavern. Amazingly, Dunham has persisted as a witness to nearly 200 years of history and change on Euclid Avenue. From stagecoach stops to car dealerships, Millionaires Row to urban renewal, Dunham has remained and serves today to connect people to a place across time. If you want to stick around after today's event, I will open up the museum. If you'd like to come and wander through and have a look, you're welcome to do that. I'm grateful to the Cleveland Foundation and the Anisfield-Wolf Book Awards for bringing us together here at Dunham today to celebrate Geraldine Brooks' Horse, the 2023 Anisfield-Wolf Book Award for winner for fiction. And I am so happy to welcome you and our special guests, even though I think many of you met them already. Members of the Cleveland Mounted Police Unit. We are lucky to have 4 of the unit members here with us. Officer George Janicek and his partner Max. And Officer Denise Dugan and her partner Larry. We are grateful for the partnership of the Mounted Police Unit, the Cleveland Division of Police, the Cleveland Police Foundation, and the Cleveland Mounted Police Charitable Trust in making this event celebrating Ms. Brooks possible. Horses played a central role on this acreage and in this city. We have a more than 100-year history of mounted police in Cleveland. And here to give us the scoop on that tradition is Woods King III of the Cleveland Mounted Police Charitable Trust. Mr. King.
Thanks for that wonderful introduction. We're here to celebrate Geraldine Brooks' book, Horse. She's a highly decorated author. Her 1905 book, March, she was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for. No higher award that I know of. The book takes place in a time in our nation's history where horses were ubiquitous. And along those lines, the Cleveland Mounted Police Unit has a rich history with Cleveland. Currently, as you can see from everybody getting together with the riders and the horses beforehand, they are the best hope for improving relations between the police and the community. They're great ambassadors of the police. They make friends in all the neighborhoods. They're real icebreakers. And there's a lot of utility also. There would not have been a parade along 9th Street in celebration of the Cleveland Cavaliers championship if it had not been for the mounted unit clearing the way. They're great at crowd control. They make a great image for the community. And again, they're just great at opening doors and having people get together. And once they know each other, people get along. as part of their history, the antecedents of the mounted police go all the way back to the founding of a private militia called the 1st Cleveland Cavalry. That was back all the way in 1877. It became Troop A of the 107th Cavalry Regiment until it was renamed in 1909 as the Cleveland Mounted Police Unit. There was an individual in Cleveland named Hugh O'Neill who was tasked with locating 81 horses colored jet black to march in the inaugural parade of President McKinley. He was allowed to spend $275 a horse, and he continued to do that for 30 years, a lot of the time spending his own money if the cost was too high. The unit marched in that inaugural parade and in the second inaugural parade. And when the mounted unit goes to an inaugural parade, it's really good for morale of the police, plus it puts our city in a great light. A lot of people around the country take note. The mounted unit participated in the inaugural parade of Warren G. Harding, and then 2 years later at his funeral procession. In 1925, John Philip Sousa, the famous March King, created a march called the Black Horse March. And in 1925, it was performed live at Cleveland Auditorium in front of approximately 15,000 people, and riders and horses rode up on the stage as part of the performance. The mounted unit participated in inaugural parades for President Eisenhower, President Nixon, President Reagan, and the first President Bush. In 1933, the mounted unit won the International Drill Team Championships at the Chicago World's Fair. That made them the best in the world. Geraldine Brooks is highly decorated, so is our own local mounted police unit. Thank you for that terrific introduction.
Thank you, Mr. King. So my mom and I are always going back and forth and giving each other book recommendations. It's fun to be the one who gets a really good one in there. She gets the credit in this case. My mom is the one who said, "You've got to read Horse." And that was for good reason, as I absolutely devoured it. So we are gathered today in a spot where the racing career of Lexington was surely closely followed. That tavern just up there on Euclid was also a community gathering place. Would have been a place where neighbors came, caught up on the news of the day, and socialized with one another. So the great stallion was capturing headlines while the stables here were definitely bustling. I'm greatly honored today to be able to welcome Geraldine Brooks, the gracious and gifted author of Horse, the novel March, and a litany of unput-downable titles. Ms. Brooks, too, also has a Cleveland tie. She was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, based in Cleveland in the early 1980s. Please help me welcome Ms. Brooks back to Cleveland and congratulate her on her Anisfield-Wolf Book Award for Horse.
Well, I've done a lot of events since Horse came out, but I've never done it accompanied by two such gorgeous horses. Give it up for them. And also in such a historic and beautifully preserved location. So it is really a pleasure to be here. I'll let that emergency vehicle go. Yes, I came to Cleveland for the first time in 1983. I was still a student at the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, pretty freshly arrived from Australia. I had won a scholarship to the graduate program. And while I was there, my intention was to get the degree and then go back to Sydney right away and get on with my real life. Well, I met two very important men that year, one of whom, Tony Horwitz, I married, and the other was the recruiter for the Wall Street Journal. And I came here to interview for a job in the Cleveland Bureau, and blow me down, they hired me. So I moved into a lovely apartment in Shaker Square, and the first thing that happened was there was a great big wide shovel by the door, and I said, "What's that for?" And they said, "You'll see." But it was a fascinating year and a half, and I learned so much. And I think anybody who comes to this country from somewhere else, if you just go to the East or West Coast, you're never going to understand this place. So I'm very grateful for my time in the Heartland. So to horse, I didn't really grow up with horses. The only horses actually I saw in my childhood were the mounted police. When they would come past our house in downtown Sydney. My mother would grab a dustpan and brush and run out into the road to see if she could score some manure for the prize rose bushes, which became slightly mortifying to me as I got a little older. But I think if you're going to become horse crazy, as I did, better you should do it at 5 or 15 and not wait till you're 50, which was what happened to me. But having never been on a horse, I always admired them from a distance. And I was at a writers' conference in Santa Fe, and it was held on a ranch, and my room just happened to overlook the corrals. And in the corrals were beautiful Appaloosa and paint horses. And I was admiring them and spending a lot of time, gazing at them. And one of the wranglers said, "You like the horses, you should come on a trail ride." And I said, "I can't ride." And he said, "Yes, you can. These horses know their job. They won't let you fall." And I believed him. And so the next day off we went, and we were riding through the beautiful pink arroyos of the Santa Fe Canyon country. And the wrangler said, "Now we're going to pick up a canter." And off we went, and it was incredible. And he was right. These horses were so sure-footed and so well-trained, and it was just an ecstatic experience. And so when I was home a few days later, I was telling a young friend how marvelous this had been. And she looked out the window of where I live on Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts, and she said, "You've got a few acres here. You could have a horse. In fact, I could give you my horse." A free horse. So many questions I should have asked. This horse was not close by. This horse was in Mexico. But I didn't care, because this horse was beautiful. And I knew that because this horse had been in a commercial. It was an ad for a fast-acting cream to treat vaginal yeast infection. Palomino mare gallops across Mexican altiplano. Voiceover. Some things should be fast. So, well, I'm trying to figure out how to get my free horse from Mexico to Martha's Vineyard. I learned how to ride a bit. When you ride I don't know how it is here in Ohio, but when you ride in Massachusetts, there's a sign in every barn that says, "An equine professional is not responsible for injury or death of a participant. Well, so I get on this horse, and every time you go around the ring, you see this or death sign. And then she says, now we're going to post the trot, and she explains how you do that. And then she says, this horse is very well trained, just gently brush his sides. He was very well trained. He was a former Grand Prix champion, and when I brushed his sides, he took off like it was a gigantic piston. And I'm trying to remember where my core muscles are, and the oh death sign is coming by faster and faster. And I'm thinking, knitting? Pottery? Maybe would have been a better activity for a 50-year-old rather than something that needs a death disclaimer. But anyway, my horse arrived, and I became so obsessed that I didn't want to think about anything else. And whenever my family were looking for me, I was either out on a trail ride or at a riding lesson or meeting with the farrier or the saddle fitter or the horse intuitive or the horse master. And there's a lot of ready going out the door in relation to this free horse, and not a lot of income coming in because I'm not sitting at my desk and writing. And I was suddenly not so interested in the book I was writing, which was set in Second Iron Age Israel, because there were no horses there, only donkeys and mules. So then a really lucky thing happened. I was invited to go to a fundraising lunch for Plymouth Patuxet Museum. And I was very glad to do that because they'd helped me so much with the research for an earlier book called Caleb's Crossing. And so I'm sitting there with a donor on either side, making polite conversation about what a rich resource of research the museum is. And I start to catch snatches of conversation from down the other end of the table, where a gentleman from the Smithsonian Institution is regaling his donors with the story of how he just delivered the skeleton of the most famous racehorse of the 19th century. And the skeleton had been languishing, forgotten in an attic in the Natural History Museum, but had just been restored to pride of place as the centerpiece of an exhibition on the history of the thoroughbred in America. Because of all the horses, this horse was central to why Kentucky is the center of thoroughbred breeding. And this horse, Lexington, was not only the fastest and most famous racing stallion, he was also the most remarkable stud stallion in American thoroughbred breeding history. And then he gets to the bit about what happened to the horse during the Civil War. At this point, my salad is uneaten. My donors no longer have a scintilla of my attention. I am leaning across the table because I know I've just found the subject for my next novel. And I left there that day knowing that this was the book I would write next. And it was great because it allowed me to think about the very thing that I wanted to be thinking about, which was horses. But little did I suspect that this story about a racehorse was also going to be a story about race in America. Because the minute I started to research the story of Lexington, I found out the centrality to his story of the labor of enslaved black horsemen, that the racing industry, which was the pastime of the mid-19th century, was built on the plundered labor and expertise of these black horsemen, many of whom were slaves or former slaves who had managed to earn their own emancipation through their high level of skills, and because what they did was so valuable to the white thoroughbred owners. So I realized that this is going to be central to the story. And I also know that the story is going to have a historical spine, the actual story of Lexington the racehorse. But I also knew straight away that it would have a contemporary thread as well, which would be the story of the horse's skeleton at the Smithsonian and what the Smithsonian does with bones and the science around osteology and what scientists can learn from bones. And so I knew that there's going to be a contemporary part. But if I'm going to be talking about race in the 19th century, I can't then have a section in the 20th century that pretends that that issue is all done and over with, because it's not. We know that. So we can't say, oh, we don't have to worry our pretty heads about that anymore. So I knew that the story of race would have to reverberate right through into the 21st century story as well. And at that point, I start to have a wobble, because I'm very aware of the discourse about white writers writing the story of Black lives. And I don't want to be another example of plundering. So I thought about abandoning the book at that time, honestly, and then I thought about centering it just on the white owners of the horse, because they're very interesting characters. They're incredibly, that each of the what hands that the horse passes into is a story in itself. They're extraordinary men. One is a loose riverboat gambler who makes and loses fortunes. Another is a famous gynecologist in Lexington, Kentucky, who delivered Mary Todd Lincoln. There are extraordinary other white characters I could have centered the story on, but I realized that that was cowardly and also absolutely inappropriate, because it would be to once again erase the contribution of the Black horseman. So I just decided that I would do the work, I would do it to the best of my ability, and I would take whatever came. So I wouldn't have been able to write the book without the help of a lot of Black friends, and I'm lucky in that regard that I live on Martha's Vineyard, which has had a thriving Black community for more than a century. And I've got to know very deeply lots of wonderful people on the island who are incredibly patient and generous in sharing their lived experience with me. And it's a pretty privileged community. We have, a lot of celebrities, filmmakers like Spike Lee, and judges, and all kinds of, very celebrated people in that community. But every single one of them has a story. Every single one of them, no matter how wealthy or well-known, has a story of fear and humiliation. And that is something that I think that we have to, be more attentive to. And I think everybody here remembers probably the story of Skip Gates, who's so central to the Anisfield-Wolf Awards, who was hauled off his own front porch and in handcuffs within 5 minutes because committing the crime of trying to open his own front door because some racist had seen a Black man trying to get into a nice house. And he's, everybody has a story like that. So I took advice and counsel and relied on the help of early readers who were always helpful to me, but in this case they were indispensable. And then the story went off in a whole other tangent that I didn't expect, because when I went to the Smithsonian to look into the science around the bones, they allowed me to visit the most extraordinary place. I think this is one of the most extraordinary places in the United States. If you've been to the wonderful museums on the Mall, only 2% of the Smithsonian collections are represented in those museums. 98% of what they have is in a huge campus in suburban Maryland called the Museum Support Center. And it ranges over acres of gigantic storage pods and laboratories, and in it is contained basically the sum of human creativity and life on Earth. It's really an extraordinary place. And you walk down the great big connecting corridor that they call the street that connects all these different labs that are looking into things like lost languages in Africa, or all the different genotypes collections or old masters' paintings. And it's very distracting because you'll be walking down and in the other direction will be coming a triceratops head on a cart. Then going that way will be a 13th century painted Chinese palanquin. It's just a really remarkable place. And my concern was with the funky corner of it called the Osteoprep Lab, where they clean and prepare bones for scientific study. And this is set quite a ways apart from everything else because bones come from carcasses. And so an elephant dies at the National Zoo. I don't suppose you've ever pondered what happens to that elephant. But it's very likely to end up at the Osteoprep Lab, where it will be allowed to decay and decompose for a while until the bones can be studied, and then they can learn things like how an elephant in captivity, how that affects their skeletal structure compared to an elephant in the wild. And the most interesting thing at the Osteoprep Lab to me is that for all the scientific advances and all the wonderful equipment that they have there and gleaming stainless steel, this and that, the work of cleaning bones is still done by bugs. So you go into this bug room, which is like a giant walk-in refrigerator, except that it's warm and humid inside because that's what the bugs like. Yeah, I can see it. You're imagining exactly what it's like. The smell is about as bad as a smell can be. And they come in and they put a dried out carcass down, and the only thing I can compare it to is buffet night for my son's high school football team. Bugs coming from everywhere, and it's like snap, crackle, and pop. You can hear them going at it. So that was all very interesting. Yeah, the former reporter in me loves getting up in other people's business, especially if they have weird jobs, and this is one of the weirdest. So that material is just falling into my notebook, and then a wonderful curator from the art museum contacted me and said, we have a portrait of your horse. Would you like to see it? And I said, sure. And she said, well, it's not on display in the galleries. It's in the study center. So we go to this study center where there's all these paintings crammed on walls, no display or anything. And there's this lovely little oil portrait of Lexington. And I said, did this come as the gift with the skeleton just after the horse died? And she said, no, interestingly, it came much later. That's weird, she said. It came in a bequest from a famous avant-garde art gallery owner named Martha Jackson, who was renowned in the immediate post-World War II period in New York as a feminist gallerist who supported the edgiest, most creative painters of the time. She was an early supporter of Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning. She coined the term op art and gave Bridget Riley her first exhibition. And everything else that she bequeathed to the Smithsonian was cutting-edge contemporary art, except this one traditional 1850s oil painting of a horse. Why did she have that painting? My novelist's imagination started running wild, and I was just too late to find out because her son, who had worked very closely with her, had just died. So there was no one to ask about why she had that painting. So I had to kind of imagine a story behind that. So it turns out that the novel has 3 strands. The 1850s, the story of Lexington's extraordinary life, the story of racing in the 18th century, which, as I indicated, was very different because it was the national pastime. Everybody still had a horse, so it was only one generation from having a horse. People like to race their own horses down the main streets of towns. That's how we got the American quarter horse, these quick quarter-mile races. And everybody followed the match races of the thoroughbreds, the champions, and the owners got enormous prestige and not to mention wealth from these horses. And they relied on the skills of the black horsemen, the trainers, the jockeys, And to me, most interesting, the grooms, because as anybody who's spent time with horses knows, that is the footstep that the horse knows when they come into the barn. It's not the owner, it's not the jockey, it's the person who's there with the green in the morning. It's the person who brushes them and grooms them, who bathes their feet with cold water after they've raced and bandages them when they're hurt and sleeps with them when they're sick. And so I knew that the crucial relationship in this story was going to be between Lexington and his groom. And I knew the name of the groom, and I knew that he was an enslaved black youth named Jarrett. And that's about all I knew, because it's very hard to find Jarrett in the records of the time. You can find hints of him. You can find hints of him in the letters where it says he's taking the horse from here to there. You can find hints of him after the Emancipation Proclamation. Alexander, who was the owner of the Kentucky farm where Lexington had his stud years, started paying his people after the Emancipation Proclamation, which was unusual, and Jarrett is there getting paid for the first time. But what it was like to be him, we don't know. So I relied on the work of Black historians who are starting to unearth the stories of these incredibly talented men who, when we think about the brutal enslavement system, occupied a unique strata, because what they did was so important to the enslavers. And it's the one place in letters that I've ever seen slave owners deferring to an enslaved person, saying, we'll see what Hark thinks about that. And my trainer, Harry, says we should do this, because usually their tone in talking about their enslaved is derogatory. It is belittling. So this is an extraordinary thing. And so I tried to find all the there's wonderful paintings of these men, often with only their first names. And I tried to ferret out their identities in the research. And every time I could give a last name to go with that first name and find something of the story, I thought, well, at least I have done something to lessen the erasure of the contribution that you made. And I hope that I've done them justice. Thank you. Have we got time to take questions? Yes, good. Okay, anybody questions? Yes. Oh.
I don't need a microphone. What is the name of your horse, and you still only have one?
Oh, well, so that horse, the first horse, you can't have one horse. I failed to mention that in the free horse expensive bit. There's no such thing as one horse. Or a free horse, yes. So that horse was named Mantequilla, and she was a Mexican ranch horse, and the young woman who gave her to me was an expert rider. And she came, and it didn't take her very long to figure out that I had no idea what I was doing. And also then she arrived on the 4th of July, and we got on quite well for a month or so, and then the weather started to turn cold. And then she was pissed. And, so to add to the expense of the free horse was the orthopedic bills. But, everybody falls off. It's just if you're 15, you're more likely to bounce than if you're in your 50s. But anyway, that horse was rehomed with a barrel racer. And then I lucked into my forever horse, who is named Valentine. And she is perfect. She and I see eye to eye on everything. And so she's still with me. And unfortunately, just a couple of months ago, we lost her pasture mate, who was an off-the-track racehorse called Screaming Hot Wings, whose name tells you everything you need to know. But Screaming Hot Wings lived to the very good age of 34 years old. And when I think about Screaming Hot Wings and all he did after his track career, how he was able to find another career as a jumping champion, and then with my next door neighbor as an event horse, and they're really crazy people, the eventers, we won't go there. And then as a school horse and a horse for little girls to take to riding shows. And then in the last 8 years when he was living with me as a trail horse, and I think of all the horses that are just either die on the track or don't make it and are thrown away. And I think that if racing doesn't start to deal better with equine welfare, then it deserves to disappear. Yeah. And also, after Screaming Hot Wings died, I got a donkey named Daisy, and she and Valentine get on very well.
And during the research you talked about on the groomsmen, trying to find background, did you actually reach out to all the Dr. Gates for assistance?
Oh, Dr. Gates is incredibly helpful to me, just working through all kinds of issues, mainly in the contemporary part of the novel, to be honest. There are a lot of black academics who specialize in this very niche field of the racing history. And luckily, there were 3 newspapers that only covered the turf, and they had huge circulation because people were so fascinated. And in those days, of course, newspapers were how most people got their information. So every race was covered. So this horse, every move he made, and when he died, his obituary ran over 6 broadsheet pages. And everybody who'd been involved with the horse reminisced. And, these papers did not cover the lives of the black jockeys or the black trainers very thoroughly, and sometimes very poorly, but you could still extract a lot from them.
Pardon me? Oh, sorry.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is El Haji, and my question is, why did you choose to name the book after, horse, as opposed to naming it after one of the characters?
Yeah, so it's a good question. Thank you. Because when the horse first was given to the Smithsonian, the skeleton, this horse was so beloved and so famous that even in his old age, very famous people were coming to visit this horse. And when he died, he was buried in a casket, which is extraordinary undertaking to bury a horse in a casket. Yeah, and then they exhumed him and sent his bones to the Smithsonian, and he was like a centerpiece of the display in the Smithsonian. Very famous as Lexington, this famous racehorse. But over the years, Lexington's fame waned, and the Smithsonian changed from being like a place where there were like exhibits of famous things, like a cabinet of curiosities, and it became a scientifically oriented research organization. So they don't have a lot of things that are just famous for being famous. And so they just exhibited Lexington then as an example of horse, Equus caballus. So he's in the Hall of Mammals, this once celebrated stallion, next to donkey, cow, deer, horse. And so at the time that the International Museum of the Horse in Kentucky was begging the Smithsonian to lend this famous racehorse back to them, he was forgotten. He's up in a dusty attic and just labeled horse. So I just thought that was so intriguing, and that I would call it. And I didn't want to call it after his name, Lexington, because that's just too confusing. Because every time you Google it, you get the town. But thanks for the question.
Oh, my name is Trey Peterson. My question was, who was your favorite character to write and why?
Oh, it was Jarrett. Because when I was thinking about him, I was thinking a lot about my youngest son, who is a bit like Jarrett. My youngest son was born in Ethiopia, and he came home to us when he was 5 years old. And he's a kiddo who keeps his own counsel. He thinks a lot more than he says. And that's very unusual in our family because we are all blabbermouths and oversharers. And Jarrett thinks very hard before he gives you his opinion, but when he does, it's usually pretty devastating. I'm sorry, Bizu. So, so yeah, that's a Freudian slip for you. So, also because everything that Jarrett thinks about the horse is something that I've thought about my own horses or something that I've observed about my own horses. So I'm giving him all the experiences and affection that I had with my own horse. And you know, so I just loved watching him grow up. And I liked... So is that what you said? But I'd say that Jarrett was my favorite character. And my second favorite is Cassius Clay, who is an actually existing historical figure. And we all know the name Cassius Clay because it was Muhammad Ali's given name. But he was apparently named after this emancipationist from Kentucky who was a white descendant of the greatest the family that owned the largest number of enslaved people in Kentucky in that day. But he broke with his family and freed all the enslaved people that he inherited, and then went on to have a newspaper that was called The True American that argued for emancipation. And of course, that made him real popular. And he had to fight off 3 assassination attempts. And one time he got shot in the chest, but instead of succumbing, he took a Bowie knife out from behind his back and killed his assailant. So he was a pretty interesting guy, and he's connected to Lexington because he was married to the daughter of the farm owner where Lexington was bred. So, yeah. I didn't go to the sporting library in Middleburg, Virginia. I went to the Beinecke has an extraordinary collection of racing papers from the era. But the library that I went to do archival research was at the Keeneland Horse Park. They have an absolutely beautiful library there, and it's a pretty niche interest for the librarians, which is super helpful, and it's really great. Yeah.
Do you have any idea of how many hours of research you did?
I couldn't tell you, but it's a lot. But I don't do it separate from the writing. I let the writing tell me what I need to know. So I'm writing the story and finding out what I don't know, and then I go and try and find it out, and then I keep going like that. Yeah.
Thank you. This is a really fun lecture. I'm so glad I got to be here. I want to ask you a question. You mentioned you sort of come to a point where you've got the facts that exist, and then you apply novelistic imagination to the service of getting back to truth and more fact as close as you can do it. I'm going to ask you a question about what are the rules of the road for doing that. But this is such a great topic because there are some people who think if you can use fiction in the right way, you could become the president, or you could run on a very big global news network. On the other hand, there's Hilary Mantel, who looks at history and comes back through fiction to tell the historians look at Thomas Cromwell differently and things like that. So maybe you could fill that in. Is it just as simple as, that I could do it, like look at the facts and then make it up and you'll get it right? I have a feeling it's way more complicated. How do you draw those lines?
Did everybody hear that question? So the question is about to summarize, the question is about what does the historical novelist, fiction writer, owe to historical fact?
And how you get it right.
Well, you want to get it right. I want to get it right.
I grew up in the South. I never knew until recently that people who were enslaved learned a lot of useful skills. Well, no, I didn't know that.
Absolutely great job training program. Isn't that amazing? Honestly. I think Eleanor Roosevelt said, learn all your history, learn the truth. It will make you love your country more. Maybe. Maybe, but I still think you need to do it. And
Since a novelist do it, how do you do it? Where do you draw that line?
I follow the line of fact as far as it leads.
Okay.
But if I can know everything, then there's no room for me. Then it's a job for a narrative historian. I was married to one for 35 years. I know the difference between what Tony Horwitz did and what I do. So also different from my life as a journalist, because in those days, you might think you know something, but if you can't confirm it with two sources, you can't write it. They used to take a dim view of making things up in my day. But for me, so I follow that line of fact until it becomes too faint. And no amount of research is going to get you a definitive answer. And at that point, I allow a well-informed, empathetic imagination to fill in the gap. But I am a great fan of the afterword. Now, Hilary Mantel is not. She says, don't apologize. And she's a goddess, by the way. Anyone who likes historical fiction, the Wolf Hall trilogy is an absolute masterpiece.
Your work's pretty great, too.
But I like to put in the afterword where I've departed from the known record. And I enjoy that when authors do it for me. So it's a service that I believe I like to do. And, and there's lots of things that you can't cram in there. You might think they're the most fascinating thing in the world, but you can't put, like Richard Tenbrook, who was the owner of Lexington during the height of the racing celebrity, was such a fascinating guy, and his life continued to be fascinating, but my interest in him finished when he sold the horse to Alexander. And I had no excuse to go and then be with him palling around with the Prince of Wales in England and losing his fortune and dying penniless in a bungalow in California. But it's a fascinating story, so it's fun to stick it at the end of the book.
So it's your empathy that leads you to the right place when you do the fiction part. That's what you said. That to me is.
I hope so, and
well,
and I don't think any attempt at empathy should be despised, because I think what we need in this country and the world right now is
They died.
We've got one more question.
Could you just touch upon the modern part of the story?
Yes,
and why you?
Yeah, without a spoiler. It's a bit hard without a spoiler, but I'll just say this. There was a personal reason and a craft reason. And the craft reason is the job of a novelist, I read somewhere when I was just starting out in the craft, is to push your protagonist's head underwater all the way through the novel. But in the end, you have to decide if you're going to sink them or let them swim. I'm a big fan of swim, because personally I hate it when a novelist leaves you to care about a character for 350 pages and pushes them off a cliff on page 351. But I have two young black male protagonists, and I thought it would be totally untrue to the racial history of this country if they both swam. So that's the craft reason. The personal reason was something I was not even aware of in the writing of the book. But halfway through it, my husband died suddenly. And I could not write for a year. And I just couldn't. But he had loved this project because he loves that period of American history. And he'd written a lot about it. And his last book we had many intersecting interests, and he helped me with my research so much. And he believed in the book when my faith was wavering about whether I could do it. So I knew I had to finish it in order to dedicate it to him. So eventually I crawled back to my desk and I finished it. And I gave it to a friend to read. And he said, you know that this is two different books and the second half of it is just full of grief. And so I didn't know that, but now I see what he means. That everything that happened to me, it just poured out on the page. And so that's a bummer to leave it on. But what a lovely event. Thank you, Cleveland. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. One more thank you to Ms. Brooks for her time. I'm the Director of Experiential Marketing and Events here at the Cleveland Foundation, and on behalf of the Cleveland Foundation and the Anisfield-Wolf Book Awards, I'd love to thank our host, Dunham Tavern, and Lauren Murray. We're so glad we're in our the Cleveland Police District, the Cleveland Police Mounted Police Unit, the Cleveland Police Foundation, and the Mounted Police Charitable Trust. Thank you so much for your partnership in putting this together. Happy Cleveland Book Week. This is the best time of year. Celebrate the spirit of all of you. I think we'll have all of you join us tomorrow to watch the sold-out Anisfield-Wolf Book Awards. It will be live streamed for free at anisfield-wolf.org if you don't have tickets. We do have a few other events this week, so please grab a Cleveland scene on your way out. But there are tickets still available for our Saturday event featuring Professor Matthew Delmont discussing his book, Half American, digs into the history of Black soldiers both at home and abroad during World War II. And it will also feature a catered lunch by the East Tech Culinary Program students, as we will be housed at East Tech that afternoon. So it is on Saturday at noon. There are still tickets available. We hope to see you all there. Ms. Brooks is going to be signing books here directly behind me, and our friends from Max Backs are selling. So please continue to stick around, get your books signed. Thank you again, and I hope to see you tomorrow for the giant celebration. Have a great evening.